So you want a good looking high airflow case, but you also want your motherboard upside down. Silverstone has just the thing. Howdy guys, Ponchato here, and today we'll be checking out their Micro ATX RL08 case. Thanks to Silverstone for setting this out for review, and let's get started. So the most distinctive feature of the RL08 is how the motherboard is mounted. That is, it's upside down. So unlike most cases, the GPU is at the top, the CPU cooler is at the bottom, and the window is on the right side of the case rather than the left. It's not just a gimmick though. Despite being only a Micro ATX case, the layout allows for 3 radiators, at front up to 280 millimeters, top up to 280, and rear 120. If you're only using air cooling, that's 2 120 or 140 fans up front, 2 120 or 140 on top, and a 120 in the back. That's significant potential cooling capacity in not that large of a case. It's only 433 millimeters long, 217 wide, and 391 tall, or in freedom units, about 17 inches long, 8.5 wide, and 15.5 tall. Build quality is overall excellent, as you would expect from Silverstone. The chassis and side panels are sturdy and don't shake or wobble, and the finish is very nice all over. My only complaint is that the front panel, which is entirely mesh, is a little bit springy toward the bottom. That's not too important in a practical sense, but I'd like to see Silverstone use a bit thicker mesh in future revisions to prevent it from flexing at all. Further on build quality, Silverstone included soft rubber pads on the bottom of the case feet to prevent it from sliding around on your desk, and decouple it to keep your desk from turning into a sounding board for any vibration. The front I/O ports are standard for today, 2 USB 3, 1 mic, and 1 headset jack. There's a nice little detail though. The power and hard drive activity LEDs are a reasonable brightness. Some cases blind you with these LEDs, so it's nice to see Silverstone keep that under control. To get inside the case, each of the side panels are held on with 2 thumb screws on the back as usual. That also means the tempered glass side panel is totally clean since it's mounted on metal rails, keeping the outside of the case looking very sleek. Now you do need to be aware that with the rear thumb screws removed, the tempered glass panel very easily slides back and will fall out. It's usually a good idea to be careful when you're handling glass panels anyway, but I almost dropped this one the first time I took off the screws, so I figured I should point that out. The RL08 has a power supply shroud that completely covers the power supply for a cleaner look inside, and has rubber pads for the power supply to sit on. The shroud also covers a 3-bay hard drive cage. The drive caddies are completely toolless, and the 2 sides simply slide apart to fit the drive in and then slide back together to lock it in place. And each caddy can also be used to mount a 2.5-inch SSD. In addition, a caddy on the back of the motherboard tray can also accommodate 2 2.5-inch SSDs, giving a total capacity of either 5 SSDs or 3 3.5-inch drives with 2 2.5-inch drives. It also has, somewhat surprisingly, a 5.25-inch drive bay. I actually really like what they did here though by making it completely removable. It's held in with screws from the front, left, and right sides, but take those out and you can clean up the interior of your case a little bit more if you won't be using an optical drive. In terms of total size capacity, the RL08 can fit CPU coolers up to 168 millimeters tall and GPUs up to 345 long. It also has 5 expansion slots with replaceable covers compared to Micro ATX's usual of 4. That gives extra room for a dual slot GPU cooler in the bottom PCIe slot, which is kind of technically the top because the motherboard's upside down, or 25 millimeter case fans for extra airflow. Mounted at the front is an adjustable GPU support bracket to prevent sagging with longer GPUs, but it only helps if your graphics card actually reaches past the front edge of the motherboard. Power supplies up to 160 millimeters will fit with the hard drive cage in the farthest back position, or up to 220 millimeters with the cage moved all the way to the front. The hard drive cage is held in place with 5 screws, which can all be removed to move it to the other 2 mounting spots, but I actually wasn't able to remove the cage entirely from the case. It wouldn't fit out the side. I'm not sure if it's intended to be removable, but I'm also curious how they got it into the case underneath the shroud to begin with. Anyway, it's adjustable enough that it shouldn't be an issue that you can't take it out. Access to the motherboard backplate is very easy with a large cutout in the motherboard tray, though it will be a bit of a challenge to install a large CPU cooler inside this case without removing the motherboard, since you don't have a whole lot of wiggle room. The stock cooling setup is very capable. The RL08 comes with 2 120mm RGB fans in the front and 1 120 fan in the back. The front panel is entirely mesh, so it has a very high airflow capacity. capacity. Having two fans up front leads to a convenient positive pressure setup by default, which is extra useful because the front fans have a very fine removable mesh filter, which should keep dust to a bare minimum inside the case. That same filter material is also used on the power supply bottom intake filter, which can be removed for cleaning without needing to tip over the case. And with the height of the case feet, the power supply has about 16 millimeters of clearance for air intake underneath, which should allow for plenty of airflow. The top panel has a magnetic dust filter, not as fine as the front filter, but it should keep larger particles from settling or getting sucked into the case. Now, due to the inverted design, the graphics card will tend to pull air through the top of the case, so it's best to leave this filter on. My only complaint with the stock cooling is Silverstone didn't include a Y splitter for the front fans. Most micro ATX motherboards will only have 2 case fan headers, so unless you have at least 3, you'll need to spend a couple extra bucks to get a Y splitter separately. Looking at the RGB effects, the front fans use the standard 4-pin RGB header, and each cable has 2 connectors at the end, so you can daisy chain them together. The colors look good through the tinted tempered glass side panel, and they aren't too insanely bright through the front mesh, though most LED control software can reduce brightness anyway. Because they use the standard 4-pin header, they can display whatever colors or effects your motherboard or RGB controller supports, so the aesthetic is up to you. And I just wanted to be clear on this because all of Silverstone's pictures of the RL08 have LEDs set to white in the white version of the case and red in the red version, but they are in fact RGB lights. You can set whatever color you want. The build process in this case is about average for a micro ATX case. No obvious flaws, but not really any breakthroughs either. Despite the motherboard being upside down, it's about like building in any other case. Cable management, on the other hand, is very nice. They included 2 large grommeted holes by the motherboard power and SATA connectors, a large grommeted and small ungrommeted hole in the power supply shroud, and plenty of cable tie-down points on the backside. Those front 2 grommeted holes are also angled, so it's easy to connect SATA cables to angled ports on the motherboard. The end result of cable management leads to a very clean look inside. There's also plenty of space on the backside for cables, a huge 40 millimeters or 1.5 inches in front and by the power supply, and 20 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch directly behind the motherboard tray. With the 140 millimeter modular power supply installed and the hard drive cage in the farthest back position, there's still plenty of room for cables without needing to force anything. With a 160 millimeter power supply, it would probably be easiest to take the screws out of the hard drive cage, move it forward, install the power supply, and then put the cage back in position once the cables are all set. Now, it does get a little cramped behind and around the CPU cooler, especially if you have one that's tall or wide. What I found in most cases, pun intended, is it's worth it to test fit the motherboard and see which headers or power supply cables will be hard to reach once the motherboard is installed. Plug those ones in first before putting it in the case, and you'll save yourself a huge amount of hassle in the build process. This is also where a modular power supply has a distinct advantage over non-modular, since you can much more easily route the power supply end of the cable through whatever cable management holes you'll be using. Now, I just want to say before we get to the benchmarks that I updated my case test procedure for more consistency, so I've had to remove most cases I previously reviewed from the comparisons. A good example of why you should try to do things right the first time. My test setup is a Ryzen 5 2400G cooled by a CryoRig H7 Quad Lumi and a dual fan GTX 1060 from ASUS. Anyway, here's the noise from the case fans alone. With all 3 fans running at a reasonable minimum speed around 400 RPM, the case is effectively silent and still provides decent airflow. At max speed, it gets a little bit, but not insanely noisy at 42.5 decibels. The nice thing about having this many fans is that increasing the number of fans lets you have the same airflow at lower RPM, which means less overall noise. Now here's the noise chart with the CPU and GPU installed. Idle noise is very low at 30.6 decibels, just barely audible in a quiet room, while low noise hits almost 50 decibels, dominated by the graphics card. The thing about PC noise is, unless your case is specifically designed to block noise from escaping by having sound absorbing foam inside, no mesh panels, and other noise blocking features, the actual volume is going to be determined mostly by the graphics card and CPU cooler rather than by the case itself. Moving on to temperature results, here we have the CPU temperatures at idle and under load, maxing out at a reasonable 39.8 degrees and idling at under 7. And these temperatures are taken after the case has completely stabilized, so this is the steady state result after everything is heated up under load. And finally, we have the GPU temperatures. The notable difference here between the RL08 and the LDO3 is due entirely to the GPU's clearance. In the LDO3, the graphics card is right up against a side panel, so airflow is restricted significantly. In the RL08, there are several inches of space between the CPU cooler and the top of the case, and the top of the case is just a large mesh intake, giving a huge cooling advantage of almost 10 degrees. case layout and design does count for something. Overall, for an MSRP of $120 US, this is a very nicely made micro ATX tower. I really like the white and black color scheme, cable management is top tier, and it has plenty of capacity for large high-end components and lots of cooling, especially if you'll be going liquid. It should be noted that Silverstone recommends a maximum radiator thickness of 30 millimeters if you'll be using 280 millimeter radiators for best compatibility with other components in the case. The RL08 is also available in a bright red with otherwise identical specs if white isn't your color of choice. I really had no major issues with the RL08 other than needing to buy a Y-splitter for the front fans, but that's a mild inconvenience in an otherwise great case. And personally, I'm very happy to see manufacturers moving away from tempered glass front panels. That just kills airflow, and honestly, I like the look of mesh more anyway. If the RL08 sounds like the case for you, follow the link in the description to pick one up for yourself. Hit subscribe and click the bell icon to get notified of new videos as soon as they're up. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit subscribe, and I want to hear from you. Do you think the RL08 looks better in white or in red? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I hope I helped, and I'll see you in the next video. Do you know how hard it is to keep your greasy mitts off of tempered glass when you're trying to shoot a video? The colors look good through the tinted tempered glass. I can't even say it. We're a modular power supply. This is also where a, oh my God, I just said it. But still, it's so pretty.